Meine Damen und Herren, ich freue mich, Sie heute Abend zu dem Vortrag Oikos and Attachment von Roger Scruton begrüßen zu dürfen. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's lecture, Oikos and Attachment by Roger Scruton. The lecture is the opening address of the conference A Sense of Place, Landschaft und Heimat im Umweltschutz, which I've organized together with Roger Scruton. In the conference, we wish to explore those aspects of environmental thinking that engage with the human need for settlement. We've brought together philosophers, geographers, and architects to discuss the many ways in which people have protected their shared natural assets through shaping them as a home. It is our view that current environmental thinking has been overly concerned with global problems and the often futile search for global solutions, and has paid insufficient attention to local ways of managing the earth and our relation to it. This is why, in the conference, we wish to study how people in Switzerland and in England have cared for the environment. We will try to find out whether their continuing concern for the Heimat could perhaps serve as a model for Europe or the wider world. So let me introduce our speaker. Roger Scruton is a philosopher and a writer. He wrote more than 40 books, not including his literary works and his musical works. He even composed 2 operas. His prolific philosophical writings range from aesthetics to ethics and political philosophy. He has written about Kant, about Spinoza, and about Richard Wagner. He's composed Platonic dialogues, and he's even written a book about wine, which has a charming title, I Drink, Therefore I Am. The 3 books which impress me most are The Aesthetics of Architecture, Sexual Desire, and The Aesthetics of Music. I think it is fair to say for each of these books that nothing that has been published in the field over the last 50 years or so comes close to it. Roger Scruton has also written a book about the topic of our conference, Green Philosophy. Just came out in January, but it is not his latest book. This is The Face of God, his Gifford Lectures. You may wonder how Roger Scruton and myself got together. We met in Princeton about 7 years ago. He lectured about Wagner's Ring, and I did some research on Henry James and love as a Rockefeller Fellow. I still remember the first words he spoke to me after Peter Singer had introduced us to each other. He asked, "Are you a musician?" And I said, "Well, yes, I play the violin, but what I really am is a philosopher." It took us then a couple of years to discover that we are both deeply troubled by the decline of the environment, and that we do not only share philosophical thoughts about natural beauty and Heimat, but also live them by living in the country, growing our own fruits and vegetables. So Roger Scruton lives on a farm near Oxford, and I live on a farm, of course, near Basel. So you know the whole story. Please, Roger, we are looking forward to your talk.
Now I'm going to be talking, well, as you will see, about oikos and attachment. I will talk informally for 40 minutes with the slides which will, I hope, summarize for you the main points that I want to discuss. These are points which arise from the writing of the book to which Angelika just referred, the Green Philosophy, in which I tried to survey, from a philosophical point of view, the environmental question as it has entered into our shared perspective in the world in which we live. And my ruling thought in writing the book was that much of the intellectual structure that is required to ask the questions that concern us has been lacking from the public debate. And it is really necessary to start from first premises and to take seriously what our own knowledge of the human psyche tells us. So I want to begin from the point that the questions that concern us about the environment have their origins in a philosophical question. The question of how individually rational human beings can combine to provide a collectively rational solution to their shared problems. And we all, I think, are familiar, not necessarily in technical terms, but in some terms or other, with the paradoxes of social choice, the paradoxes that arise when separate people get together, each pursuing rationally his or her own agenda to try and find a solution to a shared problem, and find themselves unable to do so because rational choices sum to irrational outcomes. There are some famous examples of this. The prisoner's dilemma, which I don't need to go into. Some of you will know these things, others perhaps won't. But free rider problems are perhaps more familiar to you all. The problem where, when, for instance, there's a public service that we all have to contribute to, but each of us recognizes that it would be much more rational to take advantage of it without contributing. If we all followed that eminently rational strategy, there would be no public service. This is, of course, one of the major problems of the welfare state, that we live in one big free rider problem. And we don't really know how to solve it except by borrowing from the future. Something which has led various skeptics to say that the welfare state is simply a big Ponzi scheme. Well, I won't go into that because it's obviously a controversial issue, but it shows how politics takes off from these problems. The one that concerns us in the environment is that which has acquired the name the tragedy of the commons. When something is common, let's say something commonly owned, as is, for example, a piece of pasture in a village or a lake around which people have built their own houses, then each of us has a right to use it. But of course, it becomes rational, given that everybody else is going to take things from the commons, to take as much as possible before other people expropriate the shared asset. And this tragedy of the commons is something that we are seeing in all the major environmental questions that confront us today. I only need to remind you, I'm sure, of the problem of the overfishing of the oceans, which is something which has got radically worse in recent years, but is not, as far as I know, a problem here in Switzerland, where you have a sense of who has the right to take the fish out of Lake Geneva. Singularly delicious fish which live only there. But of course you have solved the problem here, and I think there is a question, where's an example which illustrates what I want to say in this talk. Right, so another way of putting the environmental problem is in terms of what economists call externalities. All of our actions have consequences, and only some of those consequences are consequences that we are paying the cost of, so that in all economic activity there are, as it were, byproducts which impinge upon other people's ways of life and other people's budgets and fall outside our own calculations. So these external costs and benefits are things which are not part of our own equation. We inflict them upon others, and the question is, how can we be made not to do that? And another way to put this is to say, how do we protect the interest of the group from the self-interest of its members? One general approach is that of the attempt to find an external solution, to set up a body or to call upon a body which can take what is often called a top-down approach. That's to say, produce a law or a system of regulations which is imposed upon everybody from above. And this tends to be the natural response of politicians to environmental problems, to find a system of regulations which will prevent the problems from arising. There are various different forms that regulations can take. Some will just forbid a certain activity, and we are very familiar with those. For example, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a major problem in many European and American cities caused by smog. And that's fog particles condensing upon the carbon residues from coal fires, which produce those impenetrable fogs which Oscar Wilde praised as the natural product of the art of its day. But most people who were forced to suffer those things did not praise at all. Smog was forbidden by forbidding coal fires in cities. That was just a blanket interdiction which was adopted by almost all the cities in America and in Britain and led to the disappearance of smog. So there was such a successful environmental policy that politicians looked around for other ways of extending it to deal with other environmental problems. But of course, it doesn't always work in that way. First of all, because the bigger the problem, the larger the powers that are needed to solve it. And many of the problems that we're confronting today have as their originate outside the jurisdiction, outside the country which can take these legislative measures to forbid the abuse. If we try to create the powers that are sufficient to solve those problems, we come across another and really, I think, overwhelmingly important difficulty, which is the law of unintended consequences. Everything that we do has unintended consequences, and often the unintended consequences are worse than the thing that we are trying to solve. Very good example of this, which I consider in the book, is the European Union's regulation governing the management of slaughterhouses, abattoirs. The European Union decided that every abattoir has to have a qualified veterinary surgeon to inspect the animals that come in for slaughter, to ensure that they don't have a disease which could perhaps enter the human food chain in ways that adversely affect human beings. It's very rare that this happens, and most people would say that it doesn't need a vet to recognize it, but nevertheless, you have to have these vets. In Spain, you can become a vet after 1 year of practice. In England, you need 7 years at a university and postgraduate school in order to get the qualification, which means that vets are very expensive. So all our little slaughterhouses had to close down. And now the first consequence of this was that when foot and mouth disease hit our country, all the animals had to be taken across the country to the few slaughterhouses that could deal with them, which meant that the disease was spread right across the country in 2 or 3 days. And all the cows and all the sheep of my country had to be destroyed, just about all of them, at huge cost, but also a huge environmental cost, because it meant that the small farms then went out of business. The motive to farm in an environmentally friendly way was adversely affected. The knock-on effect of this, and from the environmental point of view, is huge. And that is an unintended consequence, which in a rational state of affairs, you would say, well, that means that we made a mistake. Let's go back on that. Let's not have those vets. Let's reanimate the little slaughterhouses that managed our countryside so well. But things don't work that way in the European Union. There is no process for reversing things. So it has not been reversed. And this is one of the great problems. When regulations are worked out at the top and then imposed down to the bottom, they become very difficult to reverse, because you can't reverse them from the bottom. You have to go back to the top again. And the people at the top will say, no, we've solved that one. We don't want to listen to any more arguments. We haven't got the time. It's too expensive. We've gone on to the next problem. And everybody knows that this is the great problem of the European Union. And of course, nobody can do anything about it, because that's the nature of the problem. Many people respond to these huge questions about external solutions with a thing called the precautionary principle, which again has been incorporated into European legislation, saying roughly that we must be careful not to do anything until we are absolutely sure that the environmental consequences will be positive and not negative. But you can't be absolutely sure. You've got to take risks if you're to do anything. So that the precautionary principle has the effect of saying that you mustn't do anything for the first time, which of course means that in effect you don't do anything. So you have a choice between doing huge things which have vast unintended consequences or doing nothing. And between those two manifestly irrational approaches, the advocates of external solutions are constantly drawn. So I would say that, of course, we should look for internal solutions. That's to say, solutions to our environmental problems that come from within those problems and are not imposed through regulations and overarching laws from outside. Many people, especially, of course, in American free market think tanks, advocate market solutions. A market solution is one in which the goods that you are wishing to achieve and the evils you're wishing to avoid are achieved and avoided because everything is priced right. Okay, there's a price to doing the right thing which is less than the price of doing the wrong thing, so you go for the right thing. How to develop market solutions is one of the problems that has occupied people, and I don't want to go into it now, but I think you're familiar with the arguments that were given in the Kyoto process that we should price the emission of carbon into the atmosphere in such a way that people have a market incentive for reducing it. And a lot of schemes were invented to try and create that incentive. They didn't work, but there are cases where they have worked. And the question is, can you extend those things to cover all the environmental problems that we are familiar with? Well, my answer very briefly is no, because of the problem of externalities. People externalize their costs in a market wherever they can. That's what a market encourages them to do. And if you look at how our environmental problems arise at the local level, it's almost always because somebody has seen a market opportunity to externalize his costs. For example, very simple one which I shall return to, the cost of packaging food in plastic is not something that the person who does the packaging will pay. That cost will be paid either by the person who has to dispose of that packaging later, or, because it won't be all disposed of, by future generations who have to live in a world polluted by plastic. So there's a very simple cost which is externalized, but in the market in food as is currently organized, that is a cost which is easily externalized, and indeed which is there is no incentive to internalize. So I shall come back to that and see whether there's anything that can be done about it. In my country, however, there has been a very interesting example of an ongoing internal solution to environmental problems, and that is the law of tort. This is a common law construction which has as its ruling principle that we return the costs of damage to the one who causes it. For example, if you, for instance, blow up your house because you are annoyed with the way it looks, and as a result destroy the house of your neighbour, the law of tort will tell you that you have to restore the house of your neighbour exactly as it was, or compensate him with the financial equivalent. And this law of tort has been used right since the leading case of Rylance and Fletcher in the middle of the 19th century to force people not to damage the environment of their neighbours. If they do, then they must bear the cost of it. It was used very successfully in the post-war period in my country to force factories not to pollute rivers. Because the people who were able to claim ownership of the bank of the river were able to claim damage and so on. So the law of tort is a very good example of an internal solution to environmental problems, which is what you might call a homeostatic solution. It's one that searches for equilibrium, that if the system goes wrong, so that somebody is damaged, the law of tort operates to rectify it and put it back to the equilibrium position that it was in. So it's also a kind of bottom-up solution to environmental problems. But it has this great disadvantage that there has to be somebody who is identified as the person damaged. He is the person taking the action in the court of law. And what if there is no identifiable person who's alive now, or that he's so absent or so difficult to identify that there can not be a coherent court case? That, I think, reminds you of the general problem of market solutions and legal solutions of this kind. They all seem to require identifiable agents and identifiable choices that people can make. And they don't depend upon other directed motives. I say the motives that direct us to taking other people's interests automatically into account. So this is where I think the environmental agenda should be changed, and why we should actually move on from the whole idea of the practical reasoning in the first person and look at the first person plural. Stop thinking about I, but think about we instead. And this, I mentioned there, love, command, and equilibrium. Love is a relation between people which is very much not a relation of command. It's a consensual relation in which the other's interest has equal weight to your own. And it aims at an equilibrium in which it constantly continues. That the whole purpose of love is that equilibrium of mutual affection. And brings with it a kind of practical reasoning, which is not that of commanding things or laying down laws or anything, but that of responding to the other and accounting to him. This actually is not an abnormal thing, although moral philosophers hardly talk about it. Practical reasoning is reasoning between me and you. That's the normal form of it. It's the solipsistic reasoning about my own interests is a very special case, and it's one which doesn't normally occur between natural, rational beings. Most practical reasoning is between me and you, as I give you arguments and you argue back. And the I-thou relation is fundamental to it. And out of that I-thou relation grows the first-person plural, the sense that we are doing this together. And this is reflected in the nature of many of our practical reasons. They are actually reasons which we hold to be valid for others as well as ourselves. Practical reasons become reasons because we think that others would accept them just as much as we do. And this means that in many of our ways of reasoning about the world, what I want is only one consideration. What we want becomes just as important. And when we think in this way, we don't necessarily define who we are, but we do define we across generations. That's to say, when I'm talking to you in this room about what we in Basel want, I'm not talking about what the present residents of Basel want. I'm talking about what their ancestors would have wanted and what their children will want in turn. This idea of a first-person plural that seeps across generations is absolutely normal to us. And if you imagine your family discussions, when you're thinking in a family about what shall we do, shall we go to America or not, or shall we take a stand here, and so on. There is implicit in that the absent generations who have an interest in this. Edmund Burke, who was a distinguished Irish philosopher of the late 18th, early 19th century and a politician, wrote a very famous book criticizing the French Revolution, in which he said that the theory of the social contract on which the French Revolution had depended for its legitimacy was all very well, but you must remember that if there is a social contract, it's not between the living only, but between the living, the unborn, and the dead. Only such a contract represents what we are actually committed to by our social membership. And I think he was right about that. And this is where I think our idea of home comes from. The home is the place in which those generations meet, the place which is ours and not just mine. And achieving a home is achieving a place where your first-person singular is transcended into a first-person plural. And that's what attachment means. There is a whole section of psychological theory due to this man John Bowlby about this. Bowlby was an English psychologist who actually began as a Freudian psychoanalyst, who studied what happened to children in wartime in Britain when they were taken away from their parents, sometimes lost their parents and so on, and came up with the conclusion, which all of you know to be true without studying psychology, which is that children learn to love because they are loved. They learn to give because they have been given to. And that this process is a process of attachment, which involves attachment not just to the other, but to the whole normality that surrounds the other. And I think very quickly you can expand that to give you a theory of what it is to have a sense of place. It's to have the sense of that place as ours, about which Andreas Dorschel is going to say some interesting and sceptical things tomorrow. I want to talk to finish with some illustrations of whether this makes any difference, what I'm saying. So some environmental questions that you've all thought about. First of all, climate change. This is a favourite topic, as you know, of environmental activists, largely because it's a really big problem that transcends the boundaries of the nation state. In other words, it sweeps away all this reference to home, to us, to we, to any kind of limited community which can identify a shared interest, and puts all of humanity into play, so that only a top-down solution could possibly seem to work. And then, of course, anger takes over, and the top-down solution that's favoured is the one that damages the big players. The big players being the oil companies and etc., the people who are ruining our environment. But of course, these top-down solutions damage the big players only because they damage all of us. You know, why are oil companies so successful? It's because you drive around in cars. It's all your fault, really. So this attempt to find the culprit at this level is always self-defeating. But in the European example, this has been extremely important. The Germans, as you know, have decided not to have nuclear power, not to have coal-driven power stations and so on, and to depend upon so-called renewables, and have acquired an obsession with wind farms as a result. But the consequence, of course, is that the German grid has to be plugged into the French continually to take advantage of the French nuclear power. So it's a kind of phony solution. But it appeals to many people, especially in my country, this idea, because it's a way of taking revenge against the NIMBY. The NIMBY, that means not in my backyard. The person who, the settled middle-class person who typically campaigns against wind farms and all these other things. Lenin said that socialism should be understood as electrification plus the Soviets. And it's the same idea which we see in the wind farm solution today. There is the ordinary middle-class person reduced to his natural condition beneath the electrification imposed by his superiors. But what's wrong with it? Well, I just say very quickly, you may disagree with this, but this is one of the issues that can be discussed as long as we take an open mind. It is not an adaptable solution. It won't adapt with changes in the requirements of energy or the requirements of lifestyle. It does irreversible damage to the environment. It's unreal as a solution because at maximum only, I think, 20% of power can be produced in that way, and inevitably encourages a takeover by the state. But most important for me is that it offends the only motive that counts, which is our wish to look after an inheritance. The reason why the English countryside looked so beautiful, before the wind farm was built, is that the English people have looked after it. They've looked after it because they've loved it. They've loved it because of its beauty. But once it's obliterated by wind farms, they will not love it and won't bother. And of course, this postpones the real solution to climate change, which is the scientific solution of discovering a clean source of energy. Another illustration, the problem of plastic. This is a global problem, but unlike the climate change problem, it has local solutions. You could imagine a country like Switzerland, which was plastic-free. Now, I've already given the example of the supermarket wrappings, and I think this is a paradigm case of market failure due to externalities. But it results largely from hidden subsidies offered to centralized industries. That's to say, the subsidies offered to the centralized food production and food distribution, which has killed off local food production and local food distribution almost everywhere. These hidden subsidies being things like publicly funded roads, which make it easy to go from one place to another, planning exemptions for huge distribution centres and business parks on the edges of towns, and so on. But equally important, perhaps even more important, the unnecessary health and safety regulations which insist that we wrap all our food in plastic in the first place. But the solution is to hand in this case. It needs regulations that penalise externalities and reward internal solutions. That's to say, impose a cost on people for using plastic wrappings equivalent to the cost needed to restore the damage. And one should reward internal solutions likewise. So as we know, the real result of plastic pollution is not felt just locally. It's not yet felt in the Lake of Geneva because the Swiss are so good about all this. But if you look at the sea around my country, there it is. And look at that great patch in the Pacific Ocean where I think it's something like the size of Texas now, going round and round in circles. And the stuff enters the food chain too. Fish eat it, and then we eat the fish. So, and here is the problem, and there is the solution. It's so easy. I mean, there's a bit of plastic there, but not much. Now, someone will say, well, we can't go back. This is one of those ritualistic utterances that progressive-minded people are constantly making. We must go forward. My view is that we should call what I'm advocating forward rather than back, and then it wouldn't be so difficult to understand. What I'm saying is that there are other motives than those of rational self-interest that we can call upon. And this is what I was hoping that we will get to discuss in this conference. And I give a general name to this unexplored motive, oikophilia, the love of the oikos. Oikos not just in the sense of the home, but that whole way of being in the world when one is at home. Oikos is better than heimat because it's Greek and because it doesn't have the difficult history that heimat has, which of course Germans get embarrassed by. It also reminds us of the great founding literary document of our culture, namely Homer's Odyssey, which tells the story of a person who gives up immortality and life with the goddess in order to travel at every possible cost to himself back to his oikos, there to find that indeed the supermarkets have taken over. But he, as you know, he gets back his natural form of love. Now this oikophilia, I want to say, has many different forms, and that if fully to understand the aesthetic impulse in human beings, one must see it as part of that. The love of beauty is not just something that goes on in art galleries. In fact, it hardly goes on at all in art galleries now. It's something which informs our daily lives. When we arrange a room, make our bed in the morning, lay the table for supper and so on, that kind of thing is our way of bringing our environment into our sense of place, our sense of belonging. Love of home, love of children and parents, the sense of located duty, of having a place where one's duties are and a knowledge of whom they are owed to. And I mean, one can summarize this in the concept of responsibility, but as we know, that it's wider than that. But it leads us to this sense that there are possibly bottom-up solutions to many of our environmental problems if we can animate this motive, call upon it, to bring people to act not just for their own sake, but for the sake of their home and the others who live in it. Home builders cooperate in overcoming externalities. This is something that we see very strongly in America, which has a tradition of volunteer activity to solve local problems, like collecting rubbish and bottles and so on. And in my book, I give in two chapters a description of the conservation movement in England and in America, and how it has been largely successful until the environmental activists took over in protecting a loved and cherished environment. It didn't begin in 1970 with Greenpeace. It began in 1670 with John Evelyn's book defending the forests of England against mutilation, and carried on through the Romantic movement right down to Ruskin, who gave it its first really self-conscious impulse. Well, that's something that you can talk about, but I suspect that here in Switzerland this motive has been active over the years, and indeed it's one thing for which people admire Switzerland, that it's a place conscious of being a home to its citizens. I've got just a few minutes. My final example, urbanism, which I hope we're going to talk about too. Much of the environmental movement in our time, because it has been concentrating on these big issues like climate change, has neglected the most important issue of all, which is the human habitat. Of course, we should protect the habitats of animals, but what about our own habitat? We need to settle down. It's only when we're settled down that we take each other seriously. The anonymous city is one in which people live as individuals and not as a first-person plural. And the result is that as we've seen, especially in America, the growth of urban sprawl and the edge city, the city which grows only on the edge of things and is constantly moving out. And the solution here, I would argue, is aesthetic and not economic. But I think that Hank Dittmar and, Hank at least will be talking about this tomorrow. I make various suggestions here that there should be constraints, for instance, on the height of buildings, on the boundaries. Our planning law in Britain, now under threat, puts a boundary around the town and says stop. In Paris, there are constraints on materials. That beautiful stone still has to be used in any public part. And there are constraints imposed by neighbours here in Switzerland due to your local democracy. So here are a few illustrations. This is Newark, New Jersey, in which you cannot, looking at it from the air here, find a place where you'd conceivably want to settle. But you might have to end up here, which is around New Jersey, and that goes on forever. Why can't it still be like that? This is far more concentrated, and of course very beautiful in its own right, partly because of the materials, but also because people share walls, build up against each other, have a sense that when they're building a first-person plural and not a lot of first-person singulars like that. And Paris, of course, is another way forward. The monumental but still resided in city. I just can conclude with a couple of examples. This is Florence, which has 370,000 people in it. Most of them in the centre, which has a 1 mile radius. That's 3.5 square miles, roughly, isn't it? No, yeah, pi r squared. Yes, 3.5. But a 2 mile radius overall, if you include the greater city. And here is our new town of Milton Keynes, on 88 square miles with 250,000 people. And this created by a top-down plan, of course, not by the natural coalescing of the people who lived there, but imposed from above by somebody who thinks that this is the solution to the great problem. But what was the problem? Nobody knows. The plan, in fact, was developed by an American living in California and imposed upon the English countryside, which, of course, England itself only takes up half the size of California. So that's it. And now a general discussion just to see exactly what is relevant in what I've said and what isn't.